The Bible is a moral book. What do you say to that? Someone says it's the good book. I need the Bible for morality.
The Bible is a good book. Is it a moral book? Well, that depends on what the meaning of moral is, I guess. Because the Bible says a lot of things that we don't think are particularly moral. And in fact, it not just tells us these things, it commands us to do these things, and God commands us to do these things that are pretty horrific if you're opposed morally to slavery or, polygamy or, child rape, that kind of thing.
Let's talk. It was a different time.
It was a different
time. God needed to be this strict for those people. You've heard these equivocations.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it seems like all the major religions had to start out with the time when God gave us tough love before, photography and empirical evidence came around. They had a whole different operating system, all the major religions. It's amazing to me, though, when I read the Old Testament, so many times I'll go to a story and say, so that happened, did it? And the only possible moral justification I can give is, well, it's probably just a bullshit story anyway that never happened. That's the best I can give them.
That's the best excuse we have.
Never happened. Yeah.
You don't think they're based in factual events?
Yeah, no. Yeah.
I'm not talking about the magic part, but do you think
even as history, they're very dodgy. I mean, archaeology has shown that a lot of the stories in the Old Testament are just that, stories. Like, for instance, one of the horrific ones is the destruction of the city of Ai. Horrible massacre, terrible massacre, but there's these two Tel Aviv archaeologists who wrote a book called The Bible Unearthed, Israel Finkelstein and Nils Silberman. And it's fascinating to read this book because in the last 50 years of archaeology, we've realized how much of the Old Testament is just a epic myth series, not based on any real history, not based on any archaeological findings. That city that the Israelites supposedly annihilated actually had been abandoned for thousands of years before they even showed up on the scene. Just finding out where the Israelites came from. They didn't come from Abraham, from the city of Ur. They were Canaanites, they were Moabites, they were Ammonites, they were these Western Semitic peoples that we find all through the Holy Land.
From your perspective, and I realize this may be subjective opinion, what then explains the origin of the Old Testament books? Is it our myth is better than your myth kind of a thing? Do you think these were constructions to outdo previous religions?
I do, and the other thing to remember is the Bible's old, but it's not as old as we think it is, because a lot of what we think of as Judaism, came from Persian Zoroastrianism during the Babylonian conquest. So many ideas that made their way into Christianity weren't originally part of Judaism. They were part of this other religion that nobody seems to know about much today, Zoroastrianism. But it was hugely influential. Gave us the idea of hell, gave us the idea of a good God over here and a bad God over here in conflict. The idea of the end of the world, the idea that demons can inhabit people and cause all problems, from malaria to cattle sickness to mad people screaming in the streets,
Let's talk about hell.
Yeah.
Of course, we're talking about the verse in the New Testament, "Depart from me, all you who are cursed, into a lake of everlasting fire."
Right.
But the Bible doesn't really talk a lot about hell. It certainly isn't descriptive. Where do we get hell? I mean, where does this come from?
It's a great question. And the evolution of hell is just as fascinating as the evolution of anything else we see in the Bible. I mean, I've told people for years, if you don't believe in evolution, look at Christianity, because that thing is a Darwinian motherfucker on steroids. But hell in particular, the earliest belief that the Hebrews had was much like everybody else in Mesopotamia and in ancient Greece, that the afterlife was just this gloomy place. Everybody went there. Nothing happened. It didn't matter if you were good or bad. It was all stick and no carrot, That idea didn't last long when somebody came up with the idea of, oh no, but if you're good, you get to go to the special afterlife. Then that's the one you really want to do.
So where do we get the sort of sinners in the hands of an angry God version of hell? I mean, are we talking about Dante, or there?
No, way earlier than that. I mean, definitely by the time the New Testament shows up, people are believing the Zoroastrian idea that there's a fiery hell and all the bad people go into it.
So this is a fear mechanism in place.
Absolutely.
To keep people controlled and not curious.
Yeah, yeah, basically. And it's interesting all the different iterations you see of that. in different cultures, in different ways that idea plays out.
Have you met people who carry with them a fear of hell? Were you maybe one of those people?
I used to when I was a Christian, not for me, of course, because I was Southern Baptist, and that's the one true faith, so we knew we weren't going to hell.
But you guys definitely believed in a literal hell in the Baptist church.
Yeah, and there's those things like the unforgivable sin. It's like, oh, I hope I don't forget the unforgivable sin. Oh, no, And of course, we knew everybody else was going to hell, and that's why we had to crawl through broken glass for miles to tell them that God loves them, and if we just get the word of Jesus out to them, they'll come on board with that.
How does one crawl out of sort of a fundamentalist Southern Baptist culture? What happened to you?
For me, it was so weird. A lot of people have like this gradual erosion, and for me, no, I was a staunch believer, really up to the minute. I used to flirt with this girl by having theological arguments with her. And so one day we're talking, she goes, well, Dave, the Hindu religion is like 3,000 years old in Christianity. And I was all set to jump down her case and go, oh, no, it's not. And I stopped and I realized, I have no idea if Christianity is older than Hinduism or not. And that realization hit me like a bolt from blue that I was about to say something that I didn't know if it was true or not. And the next realization was, I'm just like the Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm just parroting what I was taught. And from that instant on, Christianity never felt the same at all. It felt instantly fake, obviously fake. It's like I'd never asked myself the question, this is what I believe, is it true? I've always been inculcated with it. And from that millisecond on, it's like I didn't have to debate evolution looking at it. It's like, of course evolution is true. I didn't have to, one of the things I loved about the change that happened so fast was all of a sudden I could stop going around like the Terminator going, oh, you're saved, you're unsaved, you're unsaved, you're saved. And I could just see people like me living in a universe where we belong, we came out of, and knowing our place in it and that we're a part of it. And we're not just some tourists here before we get to, through all this crap and go to heaven. It was astounding to me how much Christ-like love I had for everyone once I jettisoned Christ. I still blows my mind.
Let's talk about Christ. You're a mythicist.
I am a mythicist.
Talk to me about your book, Nailed.
Before I do that, I should say I wasn't always a mythicist. I mean, first I was a Christian, of course, but even when I was an atheist, I was perfectly happy thinking there was a Jesus around.
Some charismatic
Christian, maybe a combination of a couple of them. Never even crossed my mind that there was no such guy at all. And what changed my mind on that, finally, was when I started getting curious about, what? You read these Gospels, and Jesus is kind of different in all of them. I wonder which is the real Jesus and what he really said and really did, and how much of that is just legendary bullshit that got piled on later. And when you try to parse that out, some interesting revelations appear. First off the bat, it's like, okay, this is all the evidence we have for Jesus? That's it? There's not more there coming along from outside? No?
Well, let me stop you there. Outside of the Bible, what evidence, quote-unquote evidence, do we have?
Well, we have excellent evidence outside the Bible for Christians, that there were people who believed in Christ. We have very little evidence for that dude himself that they worshipped. In fact, it really makes me laugh because sometimes I'll see people quote somebody like Lucian of Samosata, who his witness to Christians and Christ is that Christians are really gullible. I can't believe these guys come in and pull these marks, and that crucified guy that they worship. That's what he has to say about Jesus. Almost everything we see outside the Bible, well, not almost everything. Everything we see outside of Christian writings isn't about Jesus. It's about what Christians believe and what they say about Jesus. In a nutshell, that's the face.
What, the game? It's just a game of telephone that we're talking about here?
It's not even that, because that implies that there was a real thing at the very beginning. For me, there was this basic paradox that finally made me realize, I don't think this guy existed at all. And there's a lot to it. There's a lot to unpack about it. But it boiled down to this. Either this guy did all these amazing miracles, or at the very least said all these amazing revolutionary things, and yet no one outside his little cult noticed for almost 100 years or better. Or he didn't do any of these things. He didn't teach any of these amazing, remarkable things. And yet, as soon as he's dead, we've got all these feuding little house cults, not just in Jerusalem, not just in Galilee, but scattered all over the Roman Empire, from Egypt to Syria to Damascus to Rome itself to Greece. And none of them seems to agree on who he was or what he did or who hung out with him or what his ministry was. In fact, the Christians who talk before the Gospels are written, when they talk about Jesus, they're talking about a guy who didn't live at 666 Manger Street, in Bethlehem. They're talking about this guy who was at the center of creation at the beginning of time and who went through all the heavens and descended to hell and all these big ticket things that are all off camera in the Gospels. It's completely reversed when you go on that divide of Christianity before the Gospels and Christianity after the Gospels. Very different Jesuses.
I'm reminded of the story of the Last Supper when Jesus is betrayed by Judas, which is obviously part of God's perfect plan somehow, right? Poor Judas.
Judas. Yeah.
He was he had no choice in the matter. He had to be the
scapegoat. Yeah.
And then he has to go and point Jesus out. And I think to myself, why would you require Judas to point out the most charismatic and beloved celebrity in the land?
Exactly. And that's just one. I mean, there is. I'm working on a new book, a follow-up book to Nailed, Jesus, Mything in Action, and I'm spending, I think, about 5 or 6 chapters just on unpacking all the problems in the Gospel. Not all the Gospels, just the Gospel of Mark, our first Gospel that all our other Gospels were taken from.
Are we talking about contradicting the other Gospels or the...
No, these are just the things that don't make sense even in the story itself. Like, why do you need somebody to point out the guy who's in trouble for being so popular that 12 hours ago they were going to, afraid that the whole city was going to go in uproar. And yet all it took for them to turn them from being huge fans of Jesus to howling for his blood was just some spirited cheerleading from the Pharisees. It's like, wait. And if you know anything about the Jewish context, and Jewish scholars have been saying this for years, of course, too, nothing in that story makes sense. It's like, wait a second, Sadducees and Pharisees hated each other. Pharisees would have loved somebody like Jesus. He says the same things they do. In fact, some of his teachings come from the Pharisees. When they have a verse that's saying, he doesn't teach as the Pharisees do, yeah, he does, because he's quoting Pharisees a lot of time. They're very sentiments.
What about the different versions of the same stories? I'm a little embarrassed about how much I missed. Who discovered the empty tomb? Well, there's 3 different versions of that tale?
There's four
versions of that tale.
And ironically, the idea that Jesus ascended into heaven, actually, that's not in our first gospel at all, originally. That's not in Matthew, even now. It all boils down basically to Luke and Acts, who was written by the same guy. So everything we have about the ascension of Jesus ultimately comes from one dude who, by his own admission, wasn't a witness there.
But the argument's going to be, well, Matthew simply didn't chronicle that miracle. He wasn't there.
Yeah.
Someone else was interpreting. They were reporting, but they're reporting from different
Paper
angles.
was very expensive. They didn't always want to put there. That's the one that kills me. And you know what? If you don't know any better, sure, those arguments might sound plausible, but there's a thing called the Synoptic Problem, and this is not some fringe atheist idea. This has been the majority opinion of scholars for well over 100 years. I think more closer to 200 years now that I think about it. And what that problem says is that the relationship between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is such that we know now that they took Mark, our first gospel, the shortest gospel, the most low-rent, no-frills, fallible human Jesus, and then they improved it. A guy named we call Matthew improved it for his gospel. A guy we call Luke went later on and said, I can do better than those 2. A guy named John didn't even try to keep up with those 3 and just went off on his own. But all of them are based off of the first gospel, Mark. It's somebody taking a book and saying, I can do better. Let's do 2.0.
So we're just airbrushing the original story.
They're saying, we can beef this up. Let's reboot this here. And they weren't trying to create 4 Gospels. They weren't trying to give their own spin on things. They're taking somebody else's story and none of them, I was going to say, Matthew is taking Mark's story. Matthew's supposed to be an eyewitness. Mark's not an eyewitness. Why is he not saying, well, this is what I did with my time with Jesus? No, he's taking somebody else's story and beefing it up, adding things, taking away, fixing his mistakes, correcting his errors, including repeated mistakes that Jesus makes quoting scriptures. But I mean, even that's not even as heinous as it is, because I say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not write Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All our Gospels were originally anonymous. None of them claim to be written by eyewitnesses. None of them read like they were written by eyewitnesses. And all of them have giveaways and anachronisms and just problems that show that these were written decades, at very least, after the time, if not generations after the time they describe.
Coming from a fundamentalist Southern Baptist, I'm guessing pretty fundamental, right?
Pretty funny.
Are you struck now by how we were taught to read the Bible in a linear way, not a parallel way, right? You read Matthew, then you go to Mark and Luke and John. You don't read the crucifixion story, the last words of Jesus, what Pilate said at the trial. You don't read these things side by side, and therefore you don't really register when the incongruities appear.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating because it's even worse than that. Like so many things in biblical studies, when you read this gospel accounts side by side, not only do you see that these aren't just little contradictions of, Mark says he wore a blue t-shirt, she says he wore a red t-shirt. No, it's like, Mark says he did this thing over here, Luke says he did this thing way over here, John says he never did this thing at all. People who are like saying, well, the details are so accurate, hour by hour, it's amazing, the detail, until you compare what John has to say with what Mark has to say. And then it's like, go for the last 2 weeks of Jesus and what they're doing. They are moving in completely different reasons. Mark has Jesus getting in trouble in hot water with the Pharisees for a completely different reason than John does. In John, Jesus gets in trouble for raising Lazarus from the dead, and that's the thing that gets him put under the spotlight and in trouble. Lazarus doesn't even appear in any of the Gospels, except as a fictional name of one of the people in Jesus' parables in Luke. In all the other Gospels, we have a completely different Jesus operating on a completely different timeline, saying completely different things in a completely different way. They talk differently, they die differently, they live differently.
Let's talk about the charge that we see in Zeitgeist and others, the Horace Connection. I like to bring this up from time to time. I brought it up with Dr. Price, and I think perhaps Dr. Carrier. I'd love to talk to Bart Ehrman about it if I can ever get him on.
Sure.
It's easy for us to say, oh, look, he's a rip-off.
Right.
And then we grab whatever pagan or Egyptian deity happens to be thrown out. That's kind of a minefield, yes?
It is, and the reason is because, there are some parallels, but there's not always a parallel there. Sometimes the parallels just don't exist at all, and it's just some 19th century scholar connecting the dots where there should be no connection. There's all these parallels with the mystery faiths, but it doesn't mean that Christianity is a copycat of the mystery faiths. It doesn't mean it's a ripoff of the mystery faiths. Christianity is a mystery faith. That's the difference. That's why it's not exactly the same as Mithraism or the Eleusinian mysteries. It's the same way that Mormonism is not the same thing as Christianity, but Mormonism is a spin-off of Christianity.
So if there's an intersection, let's say there's a dying and rising God, let's say there's a crucifixion or a mortal sacrifice, ascension, any of those types of commonalities.
And all the details vary from, if you try to pin it down to one thing and say that's a mystery faith, you won't have a mystery faith because they get so hypercritical, well, this doesn't have this, so it can't be the same. But when you look the big picture at what they're selling a personal savior God, not a pantheon up on Mount Olympus. This is somebody lives in your heart. And when you see them talking about their relationship to Isis or to Mithras or whichever god we have the records for, you see them saying the same language that Christians use. Today, apologists like to say, oh, no, all our evidence for that comes from way after Christianity. Clearly, this was taken from Christianity. Well, there's such simple, great, pat answers. So why didn't the Christians ever think of that back in the day? They didn't say anything was ridiculous as, oh, these 1,000-year-old religions stole all this from us, Christianity, which was a fringe cult for 300 years, They didn't say anything remotely like that. They said just the opposite. They said, we're not saying anything different than what you're saying about your sons of gods. In fact, the devil clearly counterfeited the real Christianity and spread it around in the past before Christianity came so that we'd have all these fake Christianities waiting for us. They said the devil has his Christ. Diabolical mimicry, the lamest excuse to come out of Christianity is what we get. We don't have these sophisticated arguments from them that we do from apologists that don't hold water.
I'm interested in the mythicist versus the literal Jesus, the man Jesus argument. Is there somewhere on YouTube where both camps have taken the stage and kind of had this discussion publicly. I see a lot of blog writing going back and forth.
A lot of blog writing. I recently did a discussion with Daniel Galata, who's a up-and-coming Yale scholar. And we both are sick of the argument. We're both sick of the high level of ratcheted rhetoric. Bart Ehrman on one side and Richard Carey on the other side have become like the forebearers of historicists versus mythicists. But
Yeah, what are the chances of getting these two in the same room with a camera?
very slim, to none, I would say. But the good news is Bart Ehrman and Dr. Robert Price are going to be debating next year.
Price being a mythicist.
Price being a mythicist, Bart being a historicist. Though I have to say, and I am a huge Bart Ehrman fan, but for such a staunch historicist, he's one of the best mythicist writers out there because he's done so much to pull the curtain back on the state of Jesus studies and what a cluster it is, and how so many presumptions that they inherited from Christianity are still pervading even secular scholarship.
I was fascinated by his book, Forged.
Forged, and he has another book, Forged and Counterforged. It's even bigger than Forged. And it points out things like at every single existing New Testament text we have, every single one of them, you can see traces where they are changing it for doctrinal reasons. He's the one that points out that we have more changes in New Testament text than we do have letters in the New Testament, words and letters in the New Testament.
Now, is it doctrinal or is it like a political motivation behind
Well, it's doctrinal and political. But we're talking church politics at first because this is all happening before Christianity goes on the main scene. In fact, if the Roman Empire hadn't fallen in the 3rd century, just gone that slow decline from being really awesome to a 50-year civil war, rampant inflation, assassination after assassination after assassination, all these Mad Max type scenarios were happening to the Roman Empire. Just institutions were crumbling over the empire. And when that happened, all of a sudden this little fringe cult had been less than Jehovah's Witnesses, less than spiritualism in the 1800s. This little fringe doomsday cult turned, minor religion. Suddenly it had a lot more going for it because, Mithraism worked great as long as the Roman Empire's army kept winning. But when they start losing, if you had a religion that's mostly male Roman soldiers, it's not looking so good. Christianity, if it's been saying, all these things are going to pass away and God's going to come and judge it, that starts going, their stock starts rising. And when you have the emperor, whose mother is a Christian, suddenly say, yeah, I like the cut of your jib, Christians. Let's make you official. And pagan temples, you won't be needing all that gold and monies because we're going to shut you down, give favor to you, and we'll just keep that gold and money to ourselves. It wasn't just a religious sweep that put Christianity at the forefront. It was a political and a financial whirlwind for the Roman Empire.
So in your opinion, what explains its endurance over 2,000 years? Because this is something they'll say, well, if it's not true, why is the Bible the most popular book ever printed? Blah, blah, blah.
Blah, 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 blah.
Why Christianity over some of the other faiths? Why do you think it's lasted?
There's a very good reason for that. It is Darwin. Evolution is what keeps Christianity going because Christianity is constantly mutating, constantly branching off into new forms, new adaptations to keep up with the heresies and this new crisis and new learning and new knowledge. It's like if we took all the Christians around today and just kind of dropped a time machine, 500-year increments, they would have been all thrown in prison for what they believe now. If they had gone to Moses and said anything like the Trinity, they would have been stoned to death right out of the gate.
So it's the ability to stay relevant culturally.
Yes.
Right? Oh, look, we see it today, right? As we see Christianity.
As my good friend Seth Andrews is giving a great talk about how Christianity co-ops the best of what's around it.
Let's become like the culture.
And the biggest evidence of that is the changing reaction to evolution. The Catholic Church already embraces evolution. The evangelicals are like, oh, evolution, it's horrible, it's horrible. But you see the smarter ones, the more research ones, the more science-friendly, the more reality-friendly, saying, really, we can't stop this. We say the Earth was flat. That doesn't hold water when you see the moon and look through your telescope. So now, the next stage for the evangelicals is they're going to have to co-opt evolution. And they're going to have to say, oh, well, we've just been interpreting this wrong, but the Bible clearly teaches evolution, And in fact, it proves that Jesus is God, and we've always believed that.
So does this mean that the Bible has to become more and more parable and metaphor for them to be able to bend themselves into, the Bible is truth position, right?
'Twas ever thus. 'Twas ever thus. But the funny thing about evolution, and when you talk about Jesus myth theory is even more dangerous than evolution, because whatever kind of Christian you are, you can tweak your faith to make room for evolution and adapt and reinterpret. You can't do that with Jesus myth. There's no way that Christians can co-opt that. They can only make fun of it. They can only ignore it. They can harumph it. But they can't make it go away. And those cracks, the same cracks that in creationism led to us realizing, something's wrong with this official story. That means evolution, natural selection. That all didn't come out of, Darwin didn't get those 10 commandments of evolution from Mount Sinai. The evidence built up pressures that they couldn't ignore. The same thing is happening in biblical studies with Jesus studies.
So this brings us to a culture where people don't know their Bible, don't care what's in the Bible, don't even necessarily own a Bible, but they claim God and he has a name. His name is Jesus. Like, I believe in Jesus. Right. He walks with me and he talks with me.
Right. And how annoying is it as an atheist that you have to know their goddamn book better than they do? And we do. The studies show it.
Well, it's an odd thing, though, when someone says, I reject the foundational document that posits Jesus, but I believe in Jesus.
Well, what's even more annoying than that is when Christians say, I know the Bible's full of errors, but they act like Christianity floats above it. And that was meant by fallible men, but the Holy Spirit inspired it. It's like, we know what the book is saying, and you're saying, whatever the book says, that doesn't matter because Jesus lives in my heart.
So it's not a religion, it's a relationship.
It's a relationship, a relationship with bullshit,
Well, we have to say religion does bring comfort to a lot of people.
Well, and if it only brought comfort, I'd say, hey, I have no problem with that. But it doesn't just bring comfort. It brings all kinds of baggage that we don't need, don't want, don't like. Even Christians don't like it.
And they pound it into the skulls of young and impressionable children.
And they do. And it makes Christians very unhappy in ways that they're not even supposed to have. Mormon Utah is the highest users of antidepressants, pornography, and the highest rate of fraud in the country.
So you've got the Mormon temples, and then you've got rampant porn and drug use all around the temples, perhaps even inside the temples.
Maybe so. And I'm not letting mainline Christianity off the hook, because, you go to the South, and it's like, you track all these horrible statistics, and then you track, fundamentalists believe in Christianity, and boom, look, it's the exact same shape. These are all happening.
Wouldn't it be nice to sort of slough off all the BS and pursue reality-based solutions?
Even if Christianity was just nothing but an omnipresent good, the fact that it's not true alone, we don't have to lie to our kids to make them good people. We don't have to lie to do good things, because there's good reasons to be good.